Hi, and welcome to Mr. Fisher Science Podcasts. This podcast is on factors that limit population growth. So when we look at population growth and limiting factors, we can identify two different types of limiting factors. The first of those types is the density-dependent limiting factors. And they tend to operate when populations are large and crowded. And they affect a population because of its density. So as a population gets bigger, density-dependent limiting factors can limit population growth. So some examples of density-dependent limiting factors are things like competition. As resources become more scarce, members of a population will begin to compete for those resources. The more members of the population that you have, the more competition that occurs, and this can drastically limit populations. Predation is another density-dependent limiting factor. As the prey populations in an area increase, the predator populations will also increase. And this is due to a readily available food source. Now, if the prey population decreases, it can have the same effect on the predators, in which the predators will decrease as food becomes scarce. The next density-dependent limiting factor is disease. These here are elm trees. And the elm tree right here is suffering from what's called Dutch elm disease. Now, an elm tree in the wild tend to limit themselves and tend to be more sparsely populated. But in cities where people have put elm trees close together, because their density has increased, it's also increased the prevalence of Dutch elm disease. And you can see that this tree here is pretty much dead as a result of Dutch elm. Same is true for other populations. As you increase the amount of members of a population, you also increase the prevalence of disease that can go through that population. The fourth density-dependent limiting factor is stress. Obviously, as we increase the amount of members of a population in an area, it begins to put stress on the population. And stress can have very negative effects on populations. It can limit births, it can cause health problems, and so this would be a density-dependent limiting factor as well. Density-independent limiting factors are the other type, and they will affect a population regardless of its size. So no matter how big the population gets or how small the population is, a density-independent factor can change that population size. And we can identify two main types of density-independent factors. We have natural occurrences being things like a forest fire. So it doesn't matter if there's 10 deer in the forest or if there's 50 deer in the forest. When a forest fire comes through, it could wipe them all out equally. And that's a density-independent factor. Same thing with flooding. Flooding is another natural occurrence that can occur. Obviously, can drastically change the growth and the makeup of populations in the area. Human activity is another density-independent factor. We largely influence our environment by our actions. Something severe, like this oil spill here, would not occur naturally, but because of us, has occurred and will drastically limit populations and population growth in that particular ecosystem. So that's our density-dependent and density-independent limiting factors. And this concludes the podcast.